I'm going to go through this and I'm going to go through each section here and we're going to get an idea for, I'm going to try to explain to you these sort of concepts. So the first chapter in this, and the first thing that I want people to get a handle on, is something that I called important concepts and pitfalls. The reason why I start with important concepts and pitfalls is because the way that I view continuity is not the same way that it is often viewed in the field. I would argue that my way of doing it is more efficient for very specific reasons, and you'll see why as we go through this. So the concepts kind of inform why I'm doing this in the way that I'm doing. The pitfalls are important because people are very resistant to doing anything to do with emergency preparedness. It's too expensive, or they don't have the time, or they don't care. Great example of this, we saw it with COVID. We heavily saw it with COVID, but you see it with virtually every type of disaster. You basically have three phases of people caring about preparedness. You have before the event happens, where they don't care because that hasn't happened. You have during the event, where they don't care because they're managing the event and they're panicking. And then you have after the event, where they're so tired from the event, they don't care and they don't want to talk about it. So before, during, and after, they don't care. So it doesn't matter what you do, people just don't care. And this means that it is never a good time to talk about preparedness, while simultaneously it is always a good time to talk about preparedness. Yeah, this is one of the realities you have to deal with. So I try to deal with that right at the outset so that you can know what sort of roadblocks you're going to run into or you might run into, so you can anticipate them and try to get people in the right mindset to do this. Now, one thing before I get there, because I don't want to say, hey, these are all the reasons you shouldn't care. It is very, in almost every client I've ever had, pro bono or otherwise, they demonstrably made money from the continuity. The continuity in, there might have been one case, but I can't think of one. In every case that is coming to my mind, once they did the continuity, they ended up finding process efficiencies and ended up saving money or generating more revenue or being more efficient or whatever in normal operations while simultaneously being more prepared. So the process, when done properly, pays for itself. This, you'd think, would be attractive to people. You'd think, you get to lower your risk profile. Potentially your, insurance adjuster likes you more for certain types of insurance. You end up paying less on insurance, probably, depending on the type of insurance you have. And you make more money. You'd think that would be attractive, but still, people are hesitant with this. So anyways, it's a thing. This is not just business continuity. The reason this is called Continuity 101, a hybrid continuity and disaster risk reduction approach. The reason why the subtitle is what it is because I didn't just get experience in business continuity. I have a background in disaster risk reduction, a background in emergency management, and some background in emergency response, but that's a bit different. And that was my least proficient background is emergency response. We're talking first aid, essentially. We're not talking like policing here. But with the other parts, there are valuable lessons and things that if you integrate into a continuity program, the program is far more effective. So I'm going to explain what each of these things are because, I'll often have the conversation with somebody, hey, what do you do for work? Well, I work in disaster and emergency management. What is that? So I'm going to kind of explain what this all is. So the first one I go over is what emergency management is. If you're in America, you may have heard of FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. If you're not in America, you may have heard of some sort of emergency management organization. If you're in Australia, this would be part of your military. Emergency management is a generally government function. Their job is basically communication and coordination. So when a very, very big emergency happens, and let's say there's different tiers of incidents. I don't want to get too complicated here, but let's say you have a car accident and emergency services show up and they try to help. There's normal stuff that police, fire, and ambulance are used to. So, one person's injured or like they have a few cars that are injured. That happens a bit. There's 3 vehicles involved. There's 11 people potentially injured or fatality or whatever. And a road has to get closed. It's a major incident. This makes the evening news. Okay, that is a normal day for emergency services. Well, for those families involved in this hypothetical accident, it's the worst day of their lives. But for the police, fire, and the EMS, this is what they train for. This is what they do every single day. Some jurisdictions in Canada, when the first winter snowfall happens, if you talk to a fire chief about the statistics, especially around major cities, about how many incidents they had in the first 5 hours, they're probably giving you a 3-digit number. So we're talking about hundreds of incidences, okay? You're talking about organizations that are used to dealing with things on a massive scale. Emergency management is there for when they get overwhelmed. So emergency management does a few things. One, sometimes it's integrated with normal operations to help them more efficiently communicate. Sometimes emergency management helps them advocate for more supplies or better funding with a political element. Sometimes emergency management, I'm talking about more about the day-to-day stuff, but what emergency management is really there for, what they're really, really good at is, okay, we're overwhelmed. All of our regular stuff doesn't apply. The power's off. This has never happened before. We don't have a plan for this. Emergency management is really good at and is specialized in, okay, we need to set up a room with phones and get communications going, and we have to take chaos and create order. So reestablishing a chain of command, reestablishing a way to make decisions. And this idea of decisions comes through a lot in emergency management. It's very, very good at this. You take a situation, people go, I don't know what I'm doing. What are we doing? What are we going to do? And you identify the problem, figure out what you have, and you get the right people talking to the right people so that this thing can get resolved as quickly as possible. It's very, very good at making very quick decisions. So that's kind of what that does. Its relation to this is very often in a continuity situation, you have a head office. The head office gets shut down for whatever reason. Let's say there's a fire in the building and everyone has to escape the fire. There's about 30 minutes from when the incident starts until you can kind of manage it and start figuring out what you're going to do as a business, where you're just trying to make sure people are alive. You're trying to figure out who actually came in that day, who didn't come in that day. You're managing the immediate crisis. You don't really get to go into continuity mode until you've lived long enough to get there. And emergency management is really good at getting you to that point. If you integrate emergency preparedness, emergency management, this whole thing into your continuity program, you can often start making continuity decisions way faster. So in some businesses, the speed at which you start recovering or the speed at which you kind of get back in business is really, really relevant. One of the first things that's going to happen in larger business is if your company ends up in some sort of crisis, your competitors will look to take market share. That's standard practice. That's what they ought to be doing. It's this capitalism at work. The longer you take to get back on your feet, the greater an opportunity competitors have to start taking market share, generally speaking. This piece, this emergency management piece, helps with that speed. Things like focusing on how quickly you can get communication back up and running. When we look at later sections for solutions, and I mentioned something like a call tree, which is a type of exercise you can run to determine how much delay there is with communicating in your organization. That sort of stuff, if you lean into the emergency management piece, helps a lot. So I'm just saying, that's why this is getting pulled from this. Why am I going into this much detail? There is a lot of pushback in this specific industry behind integrating anything with continuity, and I don't want to get into the specifics of why people are getting like that and people get territorial, but from my personal experience, pulling from a few areas to bolster this is quite helpful. So I'm going into this because I think that the people that think that you shouldn't do this are wrong. So that's why, but that's my personal bias. Okay, disaster risk reduction. So this is called a few different things. Sometimes this is called disaster risk reduction. Sometimes this is called disaster risk management. Sometimes this is just called disaster management. It just depends. If you want to look up an example of this, a publicly available example would be the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Plans. They focus a lot on climate change because, frankly, in this field, climate change is generally considered the number one risk at current year 2025. It's the thing that everyone's basically focused on because of the ramifications, potential of it, research on it, the scientific focus on it, etc. It's kind of like the big one. So there's a big focus on that. But regardless of your opinions on climate change, the idea of how a risk is identified and how you address it, the sort of system is going to work regardless for whatever risk you want. So you could apply this to counterterrorism. You could apply this to volcanoes. You could apply this to really annoying phone calls you get from ornery customers. You could apply this to time efficiency loss from people calling you because they want to sell you duct cleaning. You could apply this to basically anything. Yeah, so disaster risk reduction is about analyzing risks and determining what's really going on. It's very, very useful for quick fixes. So in continuity, what you'll often do is you'll look at the whole system and you'll try to find specific things that you can kind of pull out and then fix, but it's very kind of holistic in nature. It takes quite a bit of analysis generally, and what's missing from continuity often is the quick win. You know what? That we can fix right now for this much money. We don't even have to wait for analysis, just fix it. And a lot of people are looking for, this is called in the business world, the low-hanging fruit, right? The idea of the quick, easy thing of, that's an easy decision. Let's just do that right now. If we're wrong later, or if we could have done something a bit more accurate, it's worth it just to do it really quickly. Disaster risk reduction is really good at that. There's certain risk assessments that I recommend that you do in continuity before you even go through the whole larger analysis, because you can find quick wins right away. It's really, really, really good at this. Also, disaster risk reduction is kind of a mindset. It gets you into the headspace of thinking about risks and vulnerabilities and how to like look at a problem. And once you're in that headspace, once you can kind of enter that kind of mode, you can deal with really, really stressful things and they don't feel as stressful. So it's a way to approach difficult problems in a way that's much more productive, number one. Number two, once you're there, when you start doing the continuity, you're kind of more open-minded. You're thinking about problems and solutions in such a way that it's easier to come up with really outside the box thinking. I remember I have one client that, disclaimer, I'm not going to be talking about who any of my specific clients are, period, because of obvious confidentiality reasons, but I will reference cases. Of these specific cases I'm talking about in an ambiguous way, the clients have given me consent to do that. That's why there are real life cases in this book, but I've changed the names out because no. One client that had an issue where they were going to incur a massive financial loss if the roads nearby their production lines were shut off. So they produce things in large quantities in an industry, and they need to make sure that stuff can get shipped out. Generally speaking, from their location, their main locations we were doing the risk on, their stuff gets shipped out by truck. They didn't have access to a rail line, so they were looking at alternatives for what to do. And this was quite interesting. So they looked at having a contract for heavy load helicopters to transport stuff out if necessary, because the loss was such a huge number. They were looking at emergency helicopter transport for their stuff, just so the production lines would not stop. That required a whole bunch of airspace clearance and stuff, so there was some risk associated with that. They explored building rail tracks, which was, that was an even bigger thing. That one, I mean, we explored it because they wanted to, but that one was not practical. And then what they ended up actually deciding on, which I thought was wild, but the math worked out and it was actually the most effective thing, was they built a tunnel. So they got approval from the local and second tier government in their country to build a tunnel from underneath their main building, underneath major road systems, to a separate kind of section where if they lost road access, they could have a secondary kind of exit point with it. They rejected the idea of actually building a duplicate factory in a different area that could just produce the same thing, which I thought would be a bit easier. But no, the tunnel actually won out, which I thought was wild, because you need approvals to build under government property too, like that. Like that was wild. But they built a tunnel and it worked, and they're happy. So whatever, man. That case was so interesting. But anyways, you get some of the most interesting ideas when people are in the headspace to think like this, and the disaster risk reduction piece kind of helps you get there. I go into a bit more detail about explaining each of these in the book, but I'm trying to give you the general idea here. Continuity is about get me up and running. Fundamentally, it is I'm down. I don't want to be down. I need to sell to customers. Get me up and running now. Now, how now is defined depends, because now could mean in a minute, it could mean in a week, it depends. And what get me up and running means depends. That could be fully operational, 100% whatever. This could be 50% capacity. It could be just the critical thing I need. It depends. But the idea in principle of continuity is something happened. I can't operate. I want to operate. Let's go. What continuity will often miss is prevention. And this is one of the things where the disaster risk reduction before comes in. I have seen companies implement continuity solutions. Let's say that you have a $1 million problem. You'll understand what that is later, but let's say you have a $1 million problem and you put in a $100,000 solution where if your $1 million problem is knocked out, your $100,000 solution kicks in and solves your $1 million problem. Well, if the $1 million problem never happens, you're spending $100,000 probably a year to solve a $1 million problem. So you're just spending money and you never needed it. Look, everyone buys insurance. I get it. Sure, you can do that. But this one company, in particular I'm thinking of, had a roughly $1 million problem, and they were doing a roughly $100,000 continuity solution, and they weren't spending $20. It was $20 to eliminate the problem entirely because they never did the risk reduction. And when we did the risk reduction, I helped them identify the core failure point, basically what was going on, and they just eliminated the failure point for $20. And then because of the way it worked, the problem no longer existed. So why are you spending $100,000 to deal with something that might happen when you could spend $20 and it will never happen? You can eliminate the problem entirely. This is the type of stuff where by integrating this, you can make smarter cost-benefit decisions. There are many cases, and this is something that a lot of continuity professionals do not want to admit, there are many cases where the correct continuity decision is to do nothing. It is to assume the risk. There are some instances where the cost of your program is more expensive than just allowing the incident to occur. And you should never do something that costs you more money than doing nothing. That doesn't make sense. And I mean net cost here, because gross cost is different because you can make money down the road, right? I mean net cost. Now, you might say, okay, but if I save a life, doesn't that mean that I should spend whatever money I can? Right. But then you've saved a life. So let me kind of explain this out here. If you do something that costs you money instead of doing nothing, that sort of implies that there was no real value gained here. In a family environment, Lives generally have maximum utility. They're extremely valuable. Like in an immediate family environment, you'd spend an inordinate amount of money to save a life. People go into debt and sell property to pay medical bills in some countries, right? In that case, you've valued a life to such a point that it was a worthwhile expense to do whatever your thing was. Of course, but then you're not losing any value because you value the life. In business, even if you took the most Machiavellian or you took the most dark place, think of the evil business person perspective. Look, if an employee dies to something, at best, it's bad PR. Okay, you have to retrain a new staff member. You've got to deal with employee morale. You've got to deal with potentially a government that is very not happy with you. There's a whole bunch of costs there. And then there's also the life, but it's not like this is just a zero value here. So when I say there are some instances where doing nothing is actually better off, it's because some of these solutions that people pay for are so unbelievably bad, they're better off just coming up with something ad hoc when it happens. This is not, well, actually, it happens surprisingly often because a lot of the solutions are just really bad. But by being more precise with how you're going to identify these problems and with kind of understanding how these things happen in your business better or in your family or whatever better, you can make much better decisions. A big part of this, frankly, is learning how to make much better decisions in a way that isn't that complicated. Like, we're not going to go into complex decision-making theory where we'd make decision trees and look at probabilities. And anyone anyone watching this that's done decision theory and has the math background, you can integrate that with this if you want, and you can come to better decisions, yes, but it's not required. So, like, this, once again, what I'm trying to get across here is something that if you have a grade school education, you can do this. I'm going to show you graphs. They're effectively pictures. Like there's some math in this much later on, but we're talking addition and subtraction. Like, you do not need advanced skills to do this. You need to just be in the right mindset. So, anyways, big three there that are kind of all integrated together in this. You've got emergency management, that's that communication piece, and the making better quick decisions piece. You've got the disaster risk reduction, which is your analysis and learning how to look at not just right after the incident occurs, because business continuity in a lot of ways is kind of just like a response and recovery function, but it's more helping you kind of get the whole risk spectrum here, which I'll get into later. And then you have the business continuity, which is kind of like the goal from what people want to focus on, because a lot of people kind of want that tangible piece of, okay, you know what? Something happened and then we were running again. I get it. That makes sense to me, right? That whole, well, our supplier didn't deliver the thing. There were tariffs. There's massive tariffs, and now we can't get any of the stuff delivered and we have to find a new supplier. What do we do? How long did that take? We're back in business, right? That to people, a lot of people, that one's tangible. So these three things are kind of integrated together. The focus is more on continuity, but you'll end up covering all three. Okay, so that's all integrated in there, which is good.